Welcome back to Midnight Outcry, everyone, and good evening. We're sailing tonight. 10 terrifying real-life cruise ship terror stories that will take you into the deepest seas. These terrifying stories originate straight from tourists, staff members, and guests who had an encounter aboard these floating cities that altered their perception of the vast ocean for all time. Every narrative is an authentic nightmare, derived from the accounts of actual people who ended up alone at sea with nothing but fear. These are real stories. These are confirmed accounts from people who experienced absolute terror, thousands of miles away from any possibility of escape. If this is your first time, make sure to sign up for Midnight Outcry, subscription service for daily real horror stuff that will frighten your dreams. In order to ensure that you don't miss our plunge into the depths of human anxiety, let's board these ships of fear now and see what transpires when paradise turns into a floating nightmare, where fear stalks the decks and the boundless ocean turns into your jail beneath the starry sky. To commemorate our 5th wedding anniversary, my wife Sarah and I made the decision to go on our first cruise together back in March 2019 anniversary. We had discussed it for years, but with work and saving, we were never able to find the correct time, money. At last, we reserved a 10-day Mediterranean trip on the Royal the Sea Oasis in the Caribbean, one of those enormous vessels that essentially more than 6,000 people and personnel in a floating city. The vessel was completely massive, and I mean that in every way possible. When we initially boarded, I had the impression that we were entering a different reality as we arrived at the harbor in Barcelona. There were several lakes and rocks, zip lines, Broadway-style theaters, climbing walls, and additional dining options more than I could tally. On deck 9, starboard side, our cabin had a tiny balcony overlooking the Mediterranean's limitless azure. In the initial days, everything was just as one may anticipate from an ideal vacation. We overindulged in food and beverages and spent our time discovering this floating paradise in all its facets. The vessel had evolved into our whole universe, and to be honest, we relished every second of it. We were on our 4th. I first saw her on a day at sea, halfway between the Italian and Greek coasts. We were eating breakfast and I noticed this woman seated by herself at a table close to the windows in the main dining area on deck 3. What attracted it wasn't only that she was alone that attracted attention. Although many people sail alone, there was something about her that suggested a way. She had shoulder-length brown hair, was most likely in her mid-40s, and was sporting a sundress of brilliant yellow, which looked too cheery for her disposition. She continued to scan the dining room. She was continually checking her phone, hardly touching her food, as if she were looking for someone. Sarah saw me. I simply shrugged it off and stated it was nothing as they stared and asked what was wrong. Later in the afternoon, I spotted her again while we were relaxing near the adult-only pool on deck 11. This time, she was still wearing that same yellow dress, looking around wildly as she walked along the promenade deck. She showed what appeared to be a photograph to a number of crew members, but each interaction concluded with them. They shook their heads pityingly. Her body language conveyed a sense of desperation, which made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite describe. After Sarah returned to our cabin to take a nap, I discovered that observing the woman from a distance, wondering what would be giving her such clear distress, I observed her as she walked to Deck 4's guest services desk and spoke with many employees for about an hour. Even from I could see her growing more and more irritated across the atrium. She was speaking louder now, but I couldn't read the words, and she continued to make wild hand gestures. Behind the counter, the crew members were making every effort to maintain their professionalism, but I could see they were becoming irritated with whatever she was requesting of them. At last, a white uniformed security guard came up and escorted her away from the desk after having a brief private conversation with her. Sarah and I were at our regular dinner table that night when I told our table mates about the woman. Frank and Betty, a retired couple from Ohio, have taken numerous vacations. Betty's face went white when I told her about the woman in the yellow outfit. She leaned over and lowered her voice, saying, "Oh, honey, we heard about that. She is searching for her traveling partner. It seems that her acquaintance no one has seen her since she returned to their cabin 2 nights ago." Frank grimly nodded and continued, "Ship security has been investigating it in secret, but they're not telling anyone much about it. These incidents occur more frequently than people realize. Believe, but it's not exactly promoted by the cruise lines. The following morning, around 6 a.m., I woke up. I was unable to fall back asleep. Thus, I chose to take a tour of the ship before the masses awakened. On a cruise ship, the early morning hours have an almost uncanny quality. Normally teeming with thousands of people, these enormous ships turn into abandoned settlements with just the sound of the engines and the sporadic activities of the crew. I heard voices approaching the lifeboats from around the corner when I was strolling down deck 7. Curiosity overcame me, and I cautiously walked over to observe what was going on. The woman with the yellow outfit was there, but she was now conversing with 3 crew members in what seemed to be a heated exchange while sporting pants and a t-shirt. Dialogue. One of them, a man wearing a uniform with captain's stripes, was attempting to soothe her as the other 2 stood close by. Seemed uneasy. Her voice cracked with passion as she said, "You're not listening to me." Amanda would not simply vanish. She would not go without informing me. For 20 years, we have been best friends. She experienced something. And you? People are behaving as though she simply made the decision to take a long vacation. I thought it was the officer with the stripes. Was a senior crew member of some sort, and his voice was firm but calm. "Ma'am, I can promise you that we are taking this very seriously, and that we understand your concern. We've inspected every public space, looked at security footage, and spoken with several crew members and passengers." Participants. People occasionally require space, or they may meet someone, or all they want is some time to themselves. There are plenty of peaceful areas on this enormous ship where someone could go if they desired seclusion. "Do you believe she's trying to hide from me?" Incredulous, the woman shot back. "Do you believe my best friend is engaging in a complex game of hide and seek? Are you aware of how absurd that sounds?" "Amanda suffers from diabetes. Our cabin contains her insulin. She hasn't returned to retrieve it. She hasn't been seen in 3 days." The consequences of her words struck me like a blast of icy air. This was more than just a fight or someone getting lost, along with their travel partner. This concerned a person who might be at grave danger of illness or worse. I remain hiding behind the lifeboat, listening with a knot in my stomach. The tone of the senior crew member grew increasingly somber. "We are aware of the medical condition, ma'am, and this is the exact reason we've reported this to the appropriate authorities. The Coast Guard has been contacted, and we will be carrying out a more comprehensive ship search. Additionally, we're going over every security video from the last 72 hours. However, I want you to know that with this many people on a ship this large, it's totally feasible for someone to be in a place we haven't yet searched." "How about the cameras?" she pushed. "You have to have cameras. Hell over. How recently have you seen her on camera?" There was a lengthy wait for the cop to answer. "The most recent verified sighting of your friend occurred at 11:47 p.m. Tuesday, departing the schooner bar on deck 4 at night. He trailed off after that. Following. That was what she insisted on. We lose sight of her after that," he said softly. The female released a sound that was a combination of a frustrated scream and a sob. "You're telling me that, then?" "My best friend was walking 5 minutes from our cabin to the pub. Simply disappeared aboard a ship in the middle of the sea." I was unable to stop listening. I was feeling nauseous from the entire incident, and I became aware that I was listening in on what was likely the worst time in this woman's life. I retreated silently, and Sarah was getting ready for the day when I got back to my cabin. I explained to her why I was so pale, anything that I had heard. For us, the rest of the cruise had a totally different vibe. What had seemed claustrophobic and scary after having been a carefree holiday. Each time we traversed the ship's hallways, I noticed that my perspective on the other travelers changed. Each and every time I pondered what might be concealed when we passed a deck or restricted area that was off limits to passengers. The ship's size, which had first amazed us, now felt menacing. Too many locations where someone might vanish. There are too many shadowy nooks and voids during specific hours. Other travelers told us that Amanda Mitchell, a 43-year-old Portland, Oregon resident, was the missing woman. Silently, the ship had put in place extra security measures. There were more crew members in the open spaces, and there were minor announcements requesting that travelers report any anomalous behavior. However, life goes on. The rest of the ship went on as usual. People continued to attend the nightly performances and sunbathe near the pools, and went about eating as though nothing had occurred. Our final evening on board the ship, Sarah discovered a folded piece of paper that had been tucked behind our cabin door as we were packing our bags. It was written by hand in a weak script. Please meet if you're the man who was listening close to the lifeboats yesterday morning. At midnight, I was at the solarium on deck 11. Before we dock, I have to tell someone what actually happened to Amanda. Tomorrow. They won't listen to the crew. Jennifer. Sarah and I discussed whether or not to go for more than an hour after I showed her the note. A part of me desired to obtain. Part of me was excited to hear Jennifer's thoughts, but another part of me was afraid of what I may discover. Curiosity finally prevailed, and at 11:55 p.m., we headed to the Carium, a peaceful pool area with glass enclosures that was typically empty at night. Jennifer was waiting for us, gazing out at the dark ocean while lounging in a lounge chair. She appeared to be, in the few days since I'd first met her, she had aged by years. As we got closer, she thanked us for coming as she looked up with bulging, red eyes. What she informed us of next altered my entire understanding of cruise ship safety. With a voice almost audible above a whisper, Amanda started, "I didn't just disappear." She was frightened by someone on this vessel. She had been receiving strange messages that were hidden beneath our cabin door, and someone had spent days following her around. She believed my suggestion that we report to security was paranoid, but she was truly terrified. She had gone to the bar to meet someone the night she vanished, and that person had made a claim. To learn more about the person who was pursuing her, she never returned. Jennifer continued by explaining that the staff had ignored her attempts to convince them to take the harassment seriously. It is the usual drama on a cruise liner. After Amanda vanished, she discovered the menacing messages in their cabin's trash. However, they informed her when she brought them to security that Amanda had most likely thrown them out because she was going overboard. The entire situation was being handled as though someone had gone out after drinking too much and wandered off to go somewhere and sleep it off. The following morning, we docked in Barcelona, although I was never told what eventually happened to Mitchell Amanda. Jennifer begged me to call her and provided me her contact details. I didn't hear anything, but I did find out. After we arrived home, I looked up news reports about missing people online, cruise passengers. I was astounded to learn how frequent these occurrences are in reality. According to a number of reports, the number of persons going missing from cruises is startling, frequently are never resolved. My perspective on cruise travel was totally altered by the event. What appeared to be a safe, controlled setting showed itself to be something far more intricate and possibly harmful. The water is huge and harsh, and after you're in it, the standards of law enforcement become, at best, hazy in foreign waters. Amanda Mitchell is still on my mind. Sometimes, I wonder if she was pushed, if she fell overboard by mistake, or if she's still alive at some place. However, the most of my thoughts are on Jennifer and her desperate expression. She watched helplessly as her best buddy disappeared into thin air in the midst of the Mediterranean Ocean. In August of 2017, I made the decision to celebrate my 30th birthday. I treated myself on a single cruise. After going through a difficult divorce, my therapist recommended that I might be able to analyze everything and get some perspective if I have some alone time. Thinking that being surrounded by tropical waters would help, I reserved a 7-day Eastern Caribbean cruise on the Norwegian Dawn, and a never-ending supply of entertainment would be the ideal diversion from the chaos that had overtaken my existence. As an unmarried lady, at first I was anxious about the entire experience of traveling alone, but everyone, the person I spoke with, reassured me that cruise ships were extremely secure places with security everywhere. The Dawn of Norway was a mid-sized ship with roughly 400 people, making it feel more personal, compared to the enormous floating cities that are constantly promoted. The cabin I was in was Deck 8 interior without a balcony, although I had treated myself to a bigger room because I'd be there a lot of the time. The initial days were just what I required. I ate anything I wanted and slept in late, desired. Went to the evening performances without concern for other people's schedules, and read for hours by the pool. I felt like I was beginning to recall who I was outside of my broken marriage for the first time in months. I met Marco for the first time on the third day that we were docked in St. Thomas. I was returning to around 10:00 p.m. in my cabin. Emily and I were experiencing issues with our key after spending the evening touring Charlotte. P-card. The door would not unlock no matter how I swiped it, suggesting that the magnetic strip was broken. Following several exasperating minutes of experimenting with various speeds and angles, a crew member finally showed up at the conclusion of the asked if I needed assistance in the hallway. Most likely in his late 20s, Marco had, I couldn't quite place the accent and the dark hair. Spanish or Italian, perhaps. He had a name tag identifying him as a member of the housekeeping team and was dressed in the typical crew attire. "I'll give that a try for you," he remarked, smiling amiably as he accepted my key card. On his first try, he was able to open the door utilizing a method that required holding the card at a particular angle. "These cards, they can be very tricky." He handed it back to me and explained, "But I have been working on ships for 8 years now. I know all their secrets." Thanked him before heading into my cabin, but he carried on the chat. "You're traveling alone?" "I do clean your room every day, therefore I did see that there is just one person's items." I was uneasy about the way he said this for some reason. It thought he was overly interested in the specifics of my personal space, but I assumed he was just being friendly, possibly seeking a tip, so I confirmed that yes with a courteous smile. I was going alone. He leaned against the wall and said, "That's very brave." Doorframe in a manner that made it difficult for me to enter the cabin. A lot of ladies are afraid to travel on a cruise ship by themselves. However, you appear to be quite self-sufficient. My skin crawled when he said that final word, with a little pause and an expression that seemed to stay on his face for too long. I muttered something about needing to sleep because he was tired, but he didn't seem to get the message. "If necessary, please ask for Marco if you need anything at all while on your cruise. I'm always around when it gets quiet, because I work the night shift." At last, he looked me up and down in a manner that felt totally out of place before moving away from the doorframe. I hurriedly thanked him once more before essentially slamming the door behind me, using the deadbolt and the latch for security. I made an effort to persuade myself that I was exaggerating the following morning. Perhaps Marco was simply being friendly, and I was suspicious of men's motives because of my recent divorce. However, upon my return to my cabin that afternoon, I realized right away that something wasn't right. My attire, which I would wear neatly arranged, left strewn about the room and appeared too methodical for normal cleaning. After being in a disorganized heap in my suitcase, my underwear was presently organized in tidy stacks. Even more unsettling was my journal, which I had concealed, was now seated on top of everything else in my suitcase, beneath some clothing, as though someone had been not bothered to conceal the fact that they had read it. I made sure to bring my phone, key card, and anything else I needed that night. When I left the cabin, I took anything else of value with me. Around midnight, I came back to find Marco waiting in the hallway close to my room, feigning to arrange towels while perched on a housekeeping cart. His face lit up with that same awkward smile as soon as he saw me. He said, "Ah, perfect timing," getting to his feet and obstructing my way to the door. I wanted to apologize if I came across as overly direct yesterday. Occasionally, my English does not accurately convey what I mean. I nodded and said it was no issue, even though his English seemed to be flawless. He moved closer, but I was hoping he would step aside so I could reach my cabin. "You know, I've been thinking about you while I'm at work today. It must be lonely to travel alone, eat by yourself, and watch television without anyone else. One with whom I could discuss them later." His tone was predatory, which made all of my instincts. "I get off work at 2 o'clock, so perhaps you would like some company tomorrow night." Scream danger, AM, and I am aware of areas on the ship that are extremely private and inaccessible to passengers. Romantic. I adamantly refused, saying that I was content to travel alone and didn't require companionship. However, Marco didn't appear to be put off by my rejection. He reached out and touched my arm in a way that made my skin crawl, saying, "I think you're just being shy. Women can be difficult to get at times, but I'm very patient and can wait." Yanked my arm away and firmly stated that I wanted him to leave me alone and that I wasn't interested. Immediately, the amiable attitude changed, and for a brief moment, I perceived something sinister, and his face flashed with anger. "You believe you are too good for me?" he inquired. "You believe you can treat me like I'm nothing because I'm crew and you're a passenger." Your voice drops to a whisper. There was an obvious threat in his voice, and I understood that I was all by myself in this hallway with a person who knew my schedule, could enter my room, and was... I got past him and locked the door of my cabin, which was obviously unstable, right away, but I could hear him giggling outside in the hallway. Over the course of the following 2 days, Marco's actions intensified to the point where I actually feared for my safety. He would show up everywhere I went on the ship, at the shows, by the pool, or in the dining room, constantly keeping an eye on me from a distance, but ensuring that I was aware of his presence. Every day when I went back to my cabin, I discovered my clothes were clearly soiled, my toiletries were rearranged, and more private items had been disturbed, being treated in ways that went well beyond simple cleaning. Moreover, I once discovered a note in my journal that I tried reporting, but it just said, "soon" in handwriting, which I didn't recognize. Marco to guest services, but the woman behind the desk listened to the frustratingly dismissive response, courteously addressed my worries, but clarified that crew members had undergone extensive screening and that cultural differences occasionally resulted in misconceptions regarding proper conduct. She reassured me they would talk to Marco about upholding appropriate professional boundaries, but it seemed to me they believed I was being overly sensitive, and I hardly slept that night, bouncing at. I listened to every noise in the hallway and made sure my door was locked before hearing my keycard at around 3:00 a.m. I lay motionless in bed as the reader beeped, and then someone tried to turn the door handle. Outside made a few more attempts at the handle before hearing the distinct sound of a keycard being swiped once more and once more. I had engaged from the inside, and the security latch was the only thing keeping them out. That only someone who was already in the room could open after sporadic attempts to do so for roughly 10 minutes. I didn't sleep at all, and I heard footsteps leaving the door and going down the hallway. I marched back to guest services in the morning and insisted on speaking for the remainder of the night with security. I was treated with more respect this time, particularly when I brought up the nighttime entry attempt. The security chief, a tough woman, named with increasing concern, Captain Rodriguez, listened to my story and clarified that although crew members had master key cards that allowed them to enter passenger cabins, their intended use was limited to emergencies or housekeeping within the allotted time and with the appropriate authorization. It was a serious offense that someone tried to enter my room at 3 in the morning, security breach that needed to be looked into right away. In less than an hour, Captain Rodriguez returned with unsettling information. Marco had first denied the incident when they had confronted him about it, everything, but ultimately acknowledged that he wanted to see how I was doing because he was concerned about my safety as a woman living alone. Traveler. They discovered pictures of me in his crew quarters that were clearly taken without my information. Photos of me strolling around the ship at dinner by the pool even. Even more unsettling, they discovered comparable images of other female cruise guests from earlier trips, along with what? Personal belongings such as jewelry and underwear that seemed to have been stolen were confined to quarters right away and would be handed over to the authorities. The following day when we docked in Miami, Captain Rodriguez reassured me that they would be reviewing their crew screening and that this was a very uncommon occurrence. She also offered to transfer me to a different cabin for my final stay in order to prevent similar circumstances in the future. But my only goal at that moment was to leave the ship as soon as possible. The entire ruined what was meant to be a restorative solo trip and made me deeply distrust cruise travel in general. Marco's inappropriate behavior wasn't the only thing that disturbed me, but the ease with which he had gained access to my private area and possessions without anyone being aware of or concerned. The notion that I had been sleeping in a space that could be entered at any time by someone with clear predatory intent. I never went on another cruise after that because it still gives me nightmares. I have to constantly check the locks and security latches in hotel rooms before I can unwind. Sufficient to rest. November 2020, in the midst of when cruise travel was just beginning to pick back up in the midst of the pandemic, my husband David and I made the decision to take a leisurely 14-day transatlantic journey from Miami to Southampton, which we both had been working as vital personnel during the worst of the situation. He is a paramedic, and I am an intensive care unit nurse. We urgently needed a departure from the ongoing trauma and stress that we had been enduring for months. The cruise line Celebrity Eclipse had put in place stringent health regulations, such as required testing, improved medical facilities, and decreased capacity, which gave us confidence regarding the security of journeying in these unpredictable times. The Celebrity Eclipse was a stunning. At full capacity, the ship can accommodate roughly 850 passengers, but we were sailing with only 200 people on board due to the CO restrictions. This created an almost opulent sense of privacy and space throughout the entire ship that we hadn't encountered on any prior cruises. Our cabin was located on Deck 7. For the first few days, everything felt ideal, including the balcony overlooking the endless Atlantic. Reduced wait times, more individualized attention, and an overall more laid-back setting. As medical professionals who had been coping with ongoing crises for the better part of 2 years, our 6th day at sea was just what we needed: quiet and tranquility. When everything went horribly wrong, it was about 800 meters from the closest land in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Incorrect. We heard a commotion while we were eating lunch at the Ocean Cafe buffet. A man in his 60s, most likely traveling with his wife, had abruptly appeared from the far end of the restaurant, collapsed while carrying a plate of food back to his table, initially appearing to have tripped or passed out, but when David and I hurried to assist, our medical background taking over automatically, we realized that this was something far more serious. The man, who we found out was named Robert, was awake but obviously in extreme distress. He was having trouble breathing, and his skin had turned gray. Poor, and he was clearly in pain, clutching his chest. Patricia, his wife, was. As an intensive care unit nurse, I would be kneeling next to him, sobbing, and asking what was wrong. This man was experiencing what seemed to be a massive heart attack, and I had seen these symptoms countless times before. As I attempted to calm him and reassure his terrified wife, David started monitoring his vitals right away. Minutes, the ship's medical staff, a doctor and 2 nurses, arrived. They appeared much younger and more experienced than I had anticipated. The ship's doctor, Dr. Martinez, was a gentleman who seemed to be in his early 30s. I could see the worry mounting as he started to examine Robert in his eyes. Deck 2 was the ship's medical center, and the first priority was to get Robert down there safely. The medical staff had a stretcher and basic life support equipment. However, as we moved toward the medical center through the ship's corridors, I couldn't help but observe how scarce their resources appeared to be in comparison to what we were accustomed to using in a fully. The ship's medical center was bigger than I had anticipated, but it was still essentially a small clinic with all the amenities. With a couple of exam rooms, some simple diagnostic tools, and what seemed to be roughly 6 hospital beds. Dr. Martinez started trying to stabilize Robert right away, but it soon turned into evident that the ship's medical resources were woefully inadequate to handle such a cardiac emergency. Magnitude. They had oxygen, some drugs, and simple EKG equipment. But Robert desperately needed advanced cardiac care, but there was nothing like it. Despite the best efforts of the medical staff, Robert's condition worsened over the course of the hours. His wife, Patricia, had been permitted to remain with him, and the sound of her tears filled the tiny hospital. Doctor in private, Martinez informed us that Robert required an urgent cardiac catheterization and possibly an emergency surgery, operations that could not be carried out on a cruise ship, and the closest significant medical facility was still more than 500 meters away, in the middle of the ocean. Away, and it would take at least 18 hours to get there even if the ship traveled at its fastest speed. The captain made the choice to steer the ship in the direction of the Azores, which had the nearest cardiac hospital, but everyone recognized that time was not on our side. Dr. Martinez had communicated through satellite communication with experts on land, and they were directing him. While attempting to maintain Robert's stability until we could transport him to appropriate medical care, but as night fell, Robert's condition became evidently critical and rapidly worsening. Patricia's cries woke up half the ship at 2:00 a.m. Robert had gone into cardiac arrest, and even though the medical staff tried desperately to revive him, they just didn't have the tools or knowledge required to save him. I observed through the window of the medical facility as Dr. Martinez carried out CPR for more than 40 minutes, which is much longer than the amount of time that would typically be allowed to pass in a hospital. It was heartbreaking to see the desperation on his face. He was aware that he was losing the battle against the limitations of shipboard medicine as well as Robert's condition. By 2:47 a.m., Robert was still more than 300 meters away from the closest port. Patricia's noise when Dr. Martinez eventually, I will never forget the moment they pronounced the time of death and stopped CPR, seemed to emanate from the very core of her being, a wail of pure, animalistic grief. David and I had been with the family during the ordeal, and we both shared her tears. As medical professionals, we had lost prior patients, but there was something especially heartbreaking about witnessing a death when you knew that just he might have survived if he had been in a proper medical facility a few hours closer to shore. The logistics of dealing with the whole situation was made even more horrifying by a death at sea. The ship Robert's body would need to be kept in a tiny morgue facility in the lower decks until we arrived at port. Patricia was forced to choose between continuing the cruise in the terrible situation of seeing her husband's body in the ship's morgue or attempting to plan an emergency evacuation, which could still fail despite costing tens of thousands of dollars be feasible based on the ship's location and the weather. The cruise line offered to take Patricia home 16 hours after we eventually docked there from the Azores, but she decided to remain with Robert's remains and proceeded to Southampton, where she had relatives who could assist with the arrangements. Following Robert's passing, the mood of the other crews completely changed. Word had gotten out about what had transpired throughout the ship, and there was a solemn atmosphere that no amount of amusement or activity could dispel. It was evident that the experience had traumatized Dr. Martinez. Over the next few days, David and I had multiple conversations with him, during which he revealed that this was his worst nightmare as a ship's doctor, with a patient in need of cutting-edge medical treatment that he was unable to offer, working on cruise ships for 5 years, primarily coping with common illnesses, minor injuries, and seasickness. The terrifying truth of how vulnerable travelers are when they are days away was made clear by Robert's case. From adequate medical facilities, the experience fundamentally altered my perspective on cruise travel, particularly for senior citizens. Travelers are those who already have health issues. Most people don't acknowledge that the medical services offered on cruise ships are essentially limited to urgent care clinics They lack the capacity to manage severe cardiac events, strokes, complex trauma, or any ailment that calls for sophisticated diagnostic tools or a surgical procedure. In the middle of the ocean, however, you're basically risking your life by living miles away from the closest hospital that nothing major will occur. Following the cruise, Patricia stayed in contact with us and sued she said the cruise line had made false claims about the quality of medical care offered on board. Lawyer, if the ship had been outfitted with more sophisticated cardiac care equipment, Robert might have survived. Instead of only a general practitioner, a cardiac specialist was on board, and the case was ultimately resolved out of court. But it brought to light the discrepancy between what passengers anticipate from medical care aboard ships and what's genuinely accessible in the event that something goes wrong and you're stranded in the middle of the ocean with nowhere to go. In October of 2016, Rachel, my girlfriend, and I made the decision to take a Norwegian breakaway repositioning cruise from New York to Fort Lauderdale. We had heard that repositioning cruises offered an excellent opportunity to enjoy luxury cruise travel at a significantly reduced price because the cruise lines. In any case, the 7-day trip down was necessary to relocate their ships from the Northeast to the Caribbean for the winter. At less than half the cost of a typical cruise, the Atlantic coast appeared to be the ideal romantic retreat. We thought we would spend a week taking in the stunning ocean views, ideal weather, and everything else, but we couldn't resist the offer. The conveniences of a huge cruise ship without going over budget. The Norwegian Breakaway was a monstrous vessel. Ship with 18 decks of dining options, bars, and other amenities that can accommodate over 4,000 passengers and crew our cabin on Deck 10, starboard side, with a theater and activities. The ship had all the amenities you could want, including a balcony, overlooking what we assumed would be serene. Blue Atlantic waters, Broadway, a go-kart track, a rock-climbing wall, and several pools performances, and more restaurants than we could sample in a month. On the first day, as we left New York Harbor, the October weather was crisp, and everything felt ideal, including the Statue of Liberty, but pleasant. We spent our time exploring the ship and admiring the comparatively calm seas. The floating city's engineering feat, but by the second day, things started to shift in ways that let us know we'd made a grave error. The officers of the ship had been keeping an eye on a weather system that was forming off the Carolina coast, but the small tropical disturbance they first reported was quickly becoming something far more hazardous. By the time the wind had increased considerably as they passed Atlantic City, and the ocean had changed from the mildly rolling. The ship started to rock in a way that turned the waves we had enjoyed the day before into something that appeared threatening and angry. A manner that made walking challenging, and many travelers began to complain of seasickness. The captain announced something over the ship's intercom that night at dinner that would follow me for years. We were dealing with what meteorologists now categorized as a rapidly intensifying system, Captain Hansen explained. Nor'easter, which was basically a huge storm system that was forming directly in our path. "Gentlemen and ladies," he said, his voice piercing the speakers. Over the next 48 hours, there will be some choppy seas. I want to reassure you that although the Norwegian Breakaway is designed to withstand extreme weather, I do ask that everyone exercise caution, procedures, and stay away from the outer decks whenever you can. He failed to mention that the storm was generating sustained winds of more than 70 miles per hour, with nearly 100 miles per hour. Hurricane-force winds would basically turn our floating vacation into a turning paradise into a nightmare. The ship was being tossed by midnight, in the bathtub like a toy. In our cabin, Rachel and I were lying there frantically trying to fall asleep when it seemed like, with a force that knocked us down, the entire ship abruptly dropped several stories before crashing back into the water, both out of bed. I had never heard a sound like that before. A mix of metal groaning, crashing water, and what sounded like the ship itself yelling in defiance of forces that appeared intent on tearing it apart. Separate. We believed our balcony door was securely locked, but it suddenly flew open, bringing hurricane-force winds and a wall of icy seawater into our cabin. Our faces and eyes were stung by the salt spray as we struggled against the wind to get the door shut once more. However, not before our floor was inundated with several inches of water, soaking the majority of our possessions. The situation was worse outside our cabin. The hallways of the ship, which had been crowded with contented tourists, were essentially deserted just hours ago, save for the occasional traveler who was frantically attempting to make it, clinging desperately to the railings as they made their way back to their room. The elevator's operation had been suspended for anyone not on their cabin deck was effectively stranded wherever they happened to be for safety reasons. When the storm reached its strongest point, the ship started to list at 3 in the morning, so drastically to one side that everything that wasn't secured with bolts in our cabin slid across the floor and collided with the wall. It seemed for a few frightful minutes that the ship might actually topple over. To be honest, I had no idea what to say to Rachel when she asked me if we were going to die while crying. I would never been so conscious of our vulnerability and small size in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, totally at the mercy of factors that caused our enormous cruise ship to appear like a tiny dot. Around 4 in the morning was the worst time, when somewhere deep inside the ship, we heard what sounded like an explosion, followed by a grinding mechanical noise that implied that something had malfunctioned or broken. Our cabin's lights flickered a few times before going out, total darkness, leaving us only illuminated by the emergency lights in the corridor. The engines that had been humming steadily and comfortingly, the entire journey abruptly stopped, leaving us without propulsion and without power. He floated helplessly in the storm. We could hear other travelers in the shadows, crying and screaming all over the ship. Someone was shouting and beating on the door of a cabin close to ours. They were confined. When the power went out, their electronic door locks apparently malfunctioned, making it impossible for them to get leaving their room. Unsettling shadows were created by the emergency lighting in the hallways, and the ship kept roll so hard that it was impossible to walk. We had to make our way along the floor, clinging to whatever we could find in order to reach the restroom. To their credit, the crew was doing. Despite their best efforts to control the situation, it was evident that this storm had surpassed everyone's expectations. There were sporadic announcements over the emergency communication system regarding flooding in some of the lower decks, falling objects injuring passengers, and structural damage to portions of the vessel. According to reports, the medical center was overrun with patients who'd been injured when the ship's jerky motions flung them against furniture, walls, or the floor. At around 6 in the morning, following what seemed like an eternity of being flung around at last, in the dark, the ship's emergency generators came on and partially restored power to vital systems. With a sound that sounded unhealthy and labored, engines came back online. We did, however, have some propulsion once more. Over the intercom, Captain Hansen's voice could be heard, and under his professional exterior, he could hear real fear. "We have some damage, ladies and gentlemen, to the ship's systems, but we are working to restore full functionality. Please stay in. Unless there is an emergency, stay in your cabins. We're making every effort to safely navigate the storm." When the sun came up, when we eventually caught a glimpse of the ocean outside our cabin, it was unlike anything I had ever seen. The waves loomed over the ship like shifting mountains of black water, easily 30 feet high. When the vessel would climb one, you could see for miles in all directions from these enormous swells. Nothing but furious, roiling seas that reached the horizon. After that, we would dive right into. It was like being at the bottom of a canyon, with water walls rising up on all sides of the trough between waves. Sides prepared to collapse and engulf us. The storm persisted for an additional 18 hours, when a number of passengers suffered severe injuries and needed to be airlifted from the ship. When we were close enough to land, we saw Coast Guard helicopters. The upper decks of the ship were badly damaged. The deck's furnishings had been torn off and dumped into the ocean. There were broken windows, and a portion of the pool decks, the overhang, had fallen. Flooding had damaged passenger cabins on the lower decks, forcing dozens of people to be moved to alternative housing. At last, we hobbled into Fort Lauderdale. The Norwegian breakaway appeared to have fallen 2 days behind schedule. Experienced a war. Broken windows, twisted metal, and obvious dents and scratches along the hull were all present. Parts of the ship's superstructure had been seized by the storm. As they disembarked, the passengers looked. When they eventually made it to solid land, many were kissing the ground, traumatized and shell-shocked. My perspective on cruise travel was totally altered by this experience, which also showed me how quickly a restful vacation can become a struggle for survival. Even with all of the contemporary engineering and technology that goes into these enormous ships, remain nothing more than metal boxes adrift in an indifferent ocean about vacation plans or human aspirations. I learned from the storm that when you're in the middle of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from land, you are totally dependent on forces that can suddenly become lethal. Since then, I haven't gone on another cruise. Additionally, each time I see those gleaming crews, I consider commercials that promise ideal weather and easy sailing. At night, as we prayed to survive to see morning, our ship almost shattered in the darkness. My husband Mike and I made the decision to commemorate our 15th wedding anniversary back in June 2018 anniversary with a celebrity solstice 10-day Alaskan cruise. The sight of the glaciers had always been our dream, and the interior passage's fauna. And at last, after years of saving, we spent a lot of money on a balcony cabin and what we believed would be an unforgettable trip. To pay for this cruise, Mike had been working extra hours for months. Additionally, I had utilized the majority of my vacation days for my work as a teacher at a high school. This was meant to be our opportunity to get back in touch and spend some time together, away from our everyday stressors. A stunning vessel, the Celebrity Solstice carried roughly 850 passengers, and the view of the ocean from our cabin on Deck 7 was ideal. While traveling to Alaska, we were sailing through. The ship had a sophisticated, elegant, a setting that seemed more refined than the party-oriented cruises we had previously experienced. At around 6 in the morning, following what seemed like an eternity of being flung around at last, in the dark, the ship's emergency generators came on and partially restored power to vital systems. With a sound that sounded unhealthy and labored, engines came back online. We did, however, have some propulsion once more. Over the intercom, Captain Hansen's voice could be heard, and under his professional exterior, he could hear real fear. We have some damage, ladies and gentlemen, to the ship's systems, but we are working to restore full functionality. Please stay in. Unless there is an emergency, stay in your cabins. We're making every effort to safely navigate the storm. When the sun came up, when we eventually caught a glimpse of the ocean outside our cabin, it was unlike anything I had ever seen. The waves loomed over the ship like shifting mountains of black water, easily 30 feet high. When the vessel would climb one, you could see for miles in all directions from these enormous swells. Nothing but furious, roiling seas that reached the horizon. After that, we would dive right into. It was like being at the bottom of a canyon, with water walls rising up on all sides of the trough between waves. Sides prepared to collapse and engulf us. The storm persisted for an additional 18 hours, when a number of passengers suffered severe injuries and needed to be airlifted from the ship by. When we were close enough to land, we saw Coast Guard helicopters. The upper decks of the ship were badly damaged. The deck's furnishings had been torn off and dumped into the ocean. There were broken windows, and a portion of the pool decks, the overhang, had fallen. Flooding had damaged passenger cabins on the lower decks, forcing dozens of people to be moved to alternative housing. At last, we hobbled into Fort Lauderdale. The Norwegian breakaway appeared to have fallen 2 days behind schedule. Experienced a war. Broken windows, twisted metal, and obvious dents and scratches along the hull were all present. Parts of the ship's superstructure had been seized by the storm. As they disembarked, the passengers looked. When they eventually made it to solid land, many were kissing the ground, traumatized and shell-shocked. My perspective on cruise travel was totally altered by this experience, which also showed me how quickly a restful vacation can become a struggle for survival. Even with all of the contemporary engineering and technology that goes into these enormous ships, remain nothing more than metal boxes adrift in an indifferent ocean. About vacation plans or human aspirations, I learned from the storm that when you're in the middle of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from land, you are totally dependent on forces that can suddenly become lethal. Since then, I haven't gone on another cruise. Additionally, each time I see those gleaming crews, I consider commercials that promise ideal weather and easy sailing. At night, as we prayed to survive to see morning, our ship almost shattered in the darkness. My husband Mike and I made the decision to commemorate our 15th wedding anniversary back in June 2018 anniversary with a Celebrity Solstice 10-day Alaskan cruise. The sight of the glaciers had always been our dream, and the interior passage's fauna. And at last, after years of saving, we spent a lot of money on a balcony cabin and what we believed would be an unforgettable trip. To pay for this cruise, Mike had been working extra hours for months. Additionally, I had utilized the majority of my vacation days for my work as a teacher at a high school. This was meant to be our opportunity to get back in touch and spend some time together, away from our everyday stressors. A stunning vessel, the Celebrity Solstice carried roughly 850 passengers, and the view of the ocean from our cabin on Deck 7 was ideal. While traveling to Alaska, we were sailing through. The ship had a sophisticated, elegant, a setting that seemed more refined than the party-oriented cruises we had previously experienced. The majority of the travelers appeared to be retirees with the time and resources to take these trips, couples our age or older, longer and more costly cruises. As we headed north for the first few days, everything along the Canadian coast was just as we had imagined. Gorgeous landscapes, delicious cuisine, and the type of... Our marriage had been lacking a tranquil, romantic ambiance for far too long. On our third day at sea, it happened. We first met the Hendersons at the Ocean View Cafe buffet during our lunch there. They were a couple in their early 60s who appeared to be a decent couple at first glance, were seated at the table next to ours. The man, who went by Dale, was tall, heavy-set, had graying hair, and a loud voice reverberated throughout the dining room. Susan, his wife, was quieter, smaller, and her anxious eyes hardly ever looked directly into yours when she spoke. They started talking with us regarding the cruise, inquiring about our origins and the planned excursions. Common small talk on cruise ships that occurs when you spend days at a time eating meals with strangers. Dale appeared somewhat amiable. Too eager to talk, but I was initially uneasy with Susan's actions. She continued to look at me, with an inappropriate level of intensity, examining my face, hair, and clothing as though she were learning every detail by heart. Like most people, she wouldn't turn away when I caught her staring, embarrassed. Rather, she would continue to stare while smiling in a way that avoided her eyes. While we were speaking, she asked remarkably intimate questions concerning our marriage, our employment, and whether we had children. And something changed when I revealed that we had been unsuccessfully trying to conceive for a number of years. In her face, that gave me the chills. We believed that our conversation with them would end after lunch. Hendersons. However, they appeared everywhere we went over the course of the following few days. We attended the evening performance. Somehow, they would sit directly behind us. We were sitting by the pool when they would occupy the seats across from us. At one of the specialty restaurants where we ate dinner, we would discover them at a table close by, Susan continuing her disturbing practice of looking at me the whole time. Dinner. Mike first downplayed my worries, claiming that ships weren't that large and that it was normal to encounter the same individuals over and over. However, even he began to take note of how often the Hendersons were around us. When we docked in Juneau on our 5th day, the situation became much more heated. Mike. Additionally, I had scheduled a whale-watching trip that would provide us with a respite from the ship and an opportunity to witness some of Alaska's amazing fauna. While Mike was chatting with our tour guide, Susan came up to me as I was waiting in line to board our tour bus. She received uncomfortable proximity. I was close enough to see the odd gleam in her eyes and smell her strong perfume. She said, "You know," in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, "I really see my daughter in you." She would discuss your age if she had survived. She said it with that same eerie smile, which made I retreated one step. She went on before I could reply. When I look at you from the other side of the room, I occasionally forget that you have the same build and hair color. The implication of her statement that she had been observing was that you are not her. Were so unsettling that I thought I might be her deceased daughter. Didn't know how to react. Susan switched right away when Mike came back, returning to the subject of our whale-watching tour as though nothing had occurred, but throughout the entire outing, I kept thinking about what she had said and the expression on her face. I shared the conversation with Mike when we got back to the ship that evening, and we ultimately decided that the Hendersons' actions were becoming problematic and made the decision to try to stay away from them as much as possible. For the remainder of the cruise, but staying away from cruise ship passengers, particularly those who appear to be, it was almost impossible to actively seek you out. The following morning, when we went to breakfast, Dale and Susan appeared to have been waiting as they were already seated at a table overlooking the entrance. Dale enthusiastically waved for us to come, but before we could, Susan was insisting that I sit next to her and was politely declining, patting the empty chair next to her. Breakfast? She continued to play with my hair, touch my arm, and remark on how much I looked like her angel, most likely alluding to her departed daughter. The heartwarming increased to the point where I thought I was being publicly harassed, and Susan would find reasons to give me hugs and to hold my hand while she spoke, to remove imaginary lint from my clothing when she would tighten her hold and say things like, "Don't be shy, sweetie," when someone attempted to pull away. All Mommy wants to do is the way she said, "Mommy," looking into my eyes with that deranged expression, made me feel physically ill. Mike attempted to step in when he noticed my discomfort, but Dale would quickly talk loudly with him about politics or sports, thereby dividing us so Susan could go on. Her inappropriate behavior. On the 7th day, as we were sailing through, things became unbearable. Mike and I went out to our balcony early in the morning to observe the sunrise over the glaciers in Glacier Bay. 1. We were standing there in our pajamas, drinking coffee together, and it was one of the most breathtaking sights either of us had ever seen. And finally enjoying some quiet time together, when we were horrified to hear a noise coming from the balcony next to ours. Using binoculars, Dale stood on his balcony and observed us intently, making it obvious that this wasn't a casual remark. "Good morning, neighbors," he exclaimed, as though it's quite normal to use binoculars to spy on other passengers. "What a lovely sunrise. Susan and I love seeing you two enjoy your romantic moments together. You remind us so a lot of our youth and romantic relationships." The ramifications of his remarks that it was absolutely horrifying that they had been observing us on our balcony during what we believed to be private moments. Susan showed up next to Dale before we could reply, and her face brightened with an expression of surprise when she saw me in my pajamas. "Oh honey," she yelled, her face a mix of predatory and maternal. "You look just as stunning in the morning light as my daughter did. Do you mind if I took a little images, simply to preserve this unique moment we've spent together?" The notion of this obviously unstable woman was comparing me to her deceased daughter while taking pictures of me in my pajamas. It was so unsettling that I went back inside right away and secured the balcony door. We went to guest services in the afternoon to report the Hendersons' behavior, but we received an incredibly poor response. While listening courteously, the staff member informed us that as long as the Hendersons weren't making direct, there was nothing they could do to physically attack or threaten anyone. It seems that being unsuitable and creepy was not grounds for expulsion from the ship, and since we were even if they wanted to get rid of the Hendersons, they would have no ports for the next 2 days in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Was nowhere to transport them. The horrifying culmination of the situation occurred on our Mike and I had a formal dinner in the main dining room on the 8th night, specifically asked to be seated at a table far from the one where we had previously seen the Henderson, but for some reason, they had succeeded in securing a seat at the table directly across from ours, and Susan gazed at me, with a look that had progressed from one of unease to one of genuine danger. Susan excused herself to use the restroom halfway through dinner, and I felt the need to use the restroom a short while later. Mike offered to accompany me to the restroom as well, but I told him I was okay, a choice I would later regret the remainder of my life. Susan was waiting for me in the women's restroom. With that same insane grin that had been bothering me for days, I stood by the sinks and said, "At last, we can have some. I've been waiting so long to tell you how much you mean to me, how much I value our alone time," she said, blocking the exit. "You make me think of my darling daughter. 5 years ago, she lost her life in a car accident, and getting to know you has been like reclaiming a piece of her." She stepped forward as she spoke, reaching out with hands shaking with some sort of strong emotion to touch my face. "I know this might sound," she went on, sounding increasingly agitated, "but I've been thinking that maybe this isn't a coincidental. Perhaps God sent you my way because he is aware of how much I miss her. Perhaps you could accompany us home after the journey. Her room is exactly as she left it, complete with all of her clothing, cosmetics, and other belongings. You might be our now a daughter. We might reunite as a family." Her voice was terrifying in its desperation and delusion, and I became aware that I was confined in a restroom with a person who was obviously experiencing a psychotic episode. I succeeded in shoved past her and hurried back to the dining room, where I seized Mike and informed him that we had to depart right away. We spent ordering room service, staying hidden in our cabin, and avoiding all public places for the remainder of the cruise, where we could be discovered by the Hendersons. Nevertheless, we would sometimes hear them. Susan's voice was heard knocking on cabin doors in our hallway and yelling, "Sweetie, please don't hide from Mommy." It was a sing-along tone that made us both shiver. The Hendersons were there when we eventually disembarked in Seattle. Dale attempted to console Susan as she sobbed uncontrollably the last time in the terminal. While we rushed by with our luggage, I overheard her crying about having found her daughter, but now losing her once more. The entire what was meant to be a romantic anniversary cruise had been turned into a psychological horror by experience, left us both traumatized and wondering if we would ever feel safe enough to travel once more. I learned from the experience that some of the most dangerous individuals you may come across aren't necessarily predators or criminals in the conventional sense, but people who are so devastated by loss and grief that they have become disconnected from reality and suitable social limits. On a cruise ship, you find yourself confined into spending days or weeks in a cramped area with thousands of strangers. It's impossible to determine what kind of psychological burdens that other travelers are carrying, and there is no simple way to get out of someone's mental illness starts to see you as the answer to their issues. In order to celebrate ourselves, my college roommate Jessica and I made the decision to go on a girls' trip back in February 2021. Obtaining our co-vaccinations at last, and things are beginning to return to normal. We had been under lockdown since working from home for nearly a year, and hardly ever seeing anyone outside of our immediate family. Thus, when a cruise with a lower capacity and improved safety procedures, lines resumed sailing. When the opportunity to reserve a 7-day Western Caribbean cruise on the Royal Caribbean Symphony of the Seas presented itself, we seized it. We decided that we needed a week of sun, alcohol, and making up lost time in order to get our sanity back. Following one of the most trying times in our lives. What a monstrous vessel the Symphony of the Seas was. Typically transporting more than 6,000 passengers and crew members, but operating at roughly 40% capacity because CO limitations. This gave us access to all of the ship's amazing facilities, including several swimming pools and rock climbing, Broadway performances, ice skating rinks, walls, and surf simulators, but with a small portion of the typical crowds. On deck 8, we had a small but cozy cabin with twin beds, a tiny restroom, with barely enough room for our bags. We have selected a cabin inside to conserve money. We intend to explore the ship and take in the Caribbean sunshine for the majority of our time instead of lingering in our room. The initial few days were flawless. We spent our time reconnecting, dining at various restaurants, watching the evening entertainment, and relaxing by the pool, in ways that were not possible during the pandemic with video calls. Because of the lighter passenger load, we were able to get chairs by the pool, actually. Everything felt opulent and roomy, and the bars weren't packed. We got together, other travelers our age who were also rejoicing about getting back to their regular lives, and there was a general feeling of excitement and relief aboard the ship. At last, travel was once more feasible. While we were docked in Costa Maya, Mexico on the 4th night, the idyllic trip took a horrifying turn. I had spent the day with Jessica exploring the port and shopping for souvenirs and overindulging in margaritas at a bar by the sea. We were both worn out and a little inebriated when we returned to the ship at around 10:00 p.m., prepared to crash in our cabin and rest after the adventures of the day. We were laughing about something ridiculous while fumbling with our key card. That had occurred while we were on shore. As soon as we opened the door and entered, the first thing I became aware that our cabin had a distinct smell. A manly, musky scent that most certainly hadn't been there on the morning we departed. My second observation was that our possessions had been tampered with. Our usual vacation attire, which we had left strewn all over the room, was now rearranged. Even more unsettling was the fact that our swimsuits and underwear, which had been combined with our other clothing, were now kept apart and arranged themselves on Jessica's bed in a methodical and well-planned manner. Jessica inquired, Did housekeeping come through today? However, we were both aware that housekeeping had already been completed, in addition to the fact that even the most meticulous housekeeping wouldn't entail going through our personal clothing and putting it on the bed in a display-like fashion. Upon closer inspection, we discovered additional indications that someone had visited our room, including the relocation of our toiletries. Evidently, the suitcases had been searched, and our phones, which we had left charging on the bedside table, had been disconnected and relocated. The most unsettling finding occurred when Jessica checked her browser history, which she was certain she had previously deleted, when she opened her laptop. Departing now revealed that someone had been examining her pictures, social media accounts, and even her email. She showed me the screen and muttered, "This is really creepy. Someone was in here looking at my personal information while going through our belongings. Who does that?" When the guest called guest services right away to report the intrusion, they received a frustratingly dismissive response. A young woman who appeared to have experience handling similar complaints as a services representative clarified that all cabins were accessible to crew members for maintenance and safety reasons, and occasionally passengers forgot where they had left their things. When we demanded that it was obvious that someone had looked through our trio, she offered to send security to take a report for mishandling personal belongings, but cautioned us that there was little they could do if there was proof of damage or theft. The security guard who visited our cabin, 20 Officer Martinez, listened to our concerns and, a few minutes later, showed more empathy but was just as useless. Issues and made notes, but clarified that since passenger cabins are accessible to thousands of crew members, it would be very difficult to determine who might have entered our room or to demonstrate that anything improper had happened. He offered to move us to a different room and change the locks on our cabin, but at that point in the cruise, the only options available were much more costly suites, and all comparable cabins were already occupied. Chose to remain in our cabin, but we took safety measures we never thought a cruise ship would require. Began bringing all of our electronics, personal belongings, and valuables with us whenever we left the room, even for brief excursions to pick up snacks or ice. We started leaving things in particular methods to determine whether they had been moved, and we began taking pictures of our possessions before departing the cabin, so we'd have proof in case it was disturbed again. Regretfully, our safety measures weren't sufficient. Someone returned to our cabin one day while we were eating lunch in the main dining room, and this time they had passed through our belongings with greater audacity, obviously disregarding whether we would notice. Our bras and underwear had been separated from the dirty laundry we had left in a pile by the restroom. From everything else. To make matters worse, a number of our underwear pairs were completely gone, that we were certain we had worn and packed for the first portion of the cruise. The infraction felt very intimate, and it was nauseating to think that someone was gathering our private garments as a trophy, and despite our complaints to security, they were still entering our cabin, which made us feel totally. We spent 3 more days stranded on this ship, helpless, with someone who obviously had access to our room and was utilizing that access for unsettling purposes. Jessica devised a desperate plan that night, and bravery fueled by alcohol. We would act like we were going out to dinner as normal, but one of us would hide in an attempt to catch the intruder in the act. One went to the bathroom, while the other went to eat. This was a dangerous strategy that could possibly endanger the person who was hiding, but we were so irritated by the security team's lack of response that we felt I offered to be the one hiding, as if we had no other option but to handle things ourselves. I positioned myself in the small bathroom, with the door slightly open after Jessica left for dinner, to look into the main cabin area. Nothing occurred for the first hour, and I began to believe that perhaps the intruder had gone on to annoy other travelers. But at approximately 8:30 p.m., our door was unlocked by the characteristic beep of a key card, and the individual who entered our cabin was not. What I had anticipated was a passenger, a man in his 50s, dressed in khaki shorts, rather than a member of the crew. He walked through our cabin with a small bag in his hand and a polo shirt that shouted "middle-aged tourist," with the assurance of someone who had done this several times before. I was horrified to see him go directly to our filthy laundry, grabbed a few pieces of our panties, and packed them into his bag before proceeding to our suitcases and started sorting through our fresh clothes, examining each item by holding it up before choosing a few more pieces to pilfer. What was most unsettling was how casual and systematic he was about it all. This was obviously a practiced routine, and he wasn't acting impulsively, knew exactly what he was searching for, how to locate it fast, and even took pictures of some of our possessions using. I was frozen by the images on his phone of our credit cards and IDs that we had stupidly left on the bedside table. Terrified, confined to the restroom, witnessing this invasion of our security and privacy, uncertain if I should either wait for him to leave before calling security or attempt to confront him. The man was larger than me, and since we were by ourselves in the cabin, I had no way of knowing if he would turn violent if cornered. I chose to remain covert and attempt to learn as much as I could about his identity, so that later, after 10 minutes or so, I could identify him to security. Our possessions. The man got ready to go, but not before taking out a little notepad and writing something down. He used his own key card and put the note down on Jessica's pillow. He had a key card that somehow unlocked our door and allowed him to leave as easily as he had entered. As soon as I heard the call Jessica and instructed her to return to the cabin right away before calling security to report what I had seen. The note he left, which included information about our situation, was even more unsettling than the theft. Everyday schedules, our plans for shore excursions, and private information that he could only have obtained by stalking. Call me when you want to have some real fun. It concluded with a phone number and the words, "Call me throughout the cruise." This time, when security showed up, they took things much more seriously. Officer Martinez brought extra. In order to identify the intruder, security staff started looking through the hallway security footage right away. Within 2 hours, they had recognized him as 52-year-old Californian traveler Robert Chen, who had reportedly been harassing several female passengers during the cruise while traveling alone. At least 6 different women's stolen underwear and personal belongings were discovered when they searched his cabin. Thorough notes regarding passenger habits and unapproved photos. The most startling discovery was how Chen had entered our cabin. Been paying a housekeeping crew member to give him master key cards and details regarding when particular cabins would be vacant. The crew member, who was promptly dismissed and gave Chen access to cabins during the cruise and was turned over to authorities when we docked. In return for a few $100s a day, Chen was kept in his cabin for the rest of the cruise and was taken into custody by FBI officers upon our Miami docking. Later on, we discovered that he had been doing this on several cruises during the previous 2 years, and our case assisted in putting him in touch with, due to comparable incidents on other ships. The cruise line provided us with a complete reimbursement and a complimentary cruise in the future, but neither of us was interested in ever boarding a cruise ship again. Totally undermined my feeling of security when I travel, and let me know how susceptible passengers are to both other passengers and crew members who may be acting dishonestly. The possibility that someone could enter our most private area and steal our possessions for days without anyone noticing brought to light the security flaws in these floating cities, where thousands of strangers are imprisoned together for days in a row. Since then, every hotel room I've stayed in has felt like a potential crime scene. Additionally, I now bring concealed cameras, doctor alarms, and an obsession with protecting my personal property, which I had never needed prior to that terrible cruise. My brother Tom and I made the decision to take our first guys since college to commemorate his advancement to senior partner at his law firm. To be honest, we both needed something to remind us that we had gone through challenging divorces in the previous year. Tom had consistently been the responsible one, showing us that life could still be exciting and adventurous. Older brother who never takes time for himself while working 80 hours a week, so when he recommended that we reserve a 12-day transatlantic cruise on the Queen Mary II from Southampton to New York, I was startled, but instantly agreed. The thought of spending almost 2 weeks crossing or traveling across the Atlantic on one of the world's most well-known ocean liners seemed like the ideal way to get away from our issues and get back together as brothers. The Queen Mary II was everything you could have imagined. From Cunard's flagship ship, a graceful, sophisticated, and maritimely infused tradition. This was a real ocean liner, not some floating amusement park like the more recent cruise ships, constructed with the serious goal of comfortably and stylishly traversing the Atlantic. The ship carried roughly 600 passengers and was built with the traditional elegance of the heyday of maritime travel. Our stateroom on Deck 6 was exquisitely furnished with exquisite furnishings, rich wood paneling, and a porthole overlooking the vast region of the North Atlantic. During the initial days of our voyage, everything felt ideal as they sailed away from England into progressively choppy waters. Formal meals, afternoon tea, guest speaker lectures, and the type of a refined setting that gave you the impression that you were taking part in a historical event. The ship had been constructed in 2003, equipped with all the contemporary safety features and backup plans you would anticipate from a ship built to traverse one of the world's most hazardous waterways. Several backup generators, satellite communication devices, sophisticated fire suppression systems, and enough lifeboats to accommodate twice the number of passengers. After more than 30 years of Atlantic sailing, Captain Williams provided daily updates on our progress in the upcoming weather, and his cool, collected manner made everyone feel assured that we were in good hands for the 6-day ocean voyage. It was on our 4th day at sea, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, about 200 meters from the nearest land. Tom and I were eating lunch at the Britannia restaurant when we first realized something wasn't right. A number of lights flickered quickly, one after the other, and each flicker was short. Even though they only lasted a second or two each time, they were sufficiently noticeable to interrupt conversations in the dining room. Stopped as travelers gazed in confusion at the elaborate chandeliers. Facial expressions. The waitstaff carried on as though nothing had occurred, but as they looked at one another, you could see the worry in their eyes. An hour or so later, as we were in the ship's planetarium listening to a lecture, when the lights flickered once more. This time, there was a slight but noticeable shift in the ship's engine noise. The continuous comforting, the hum that had accompanied us for the previous few days, took on an erratic rhythm, resembling a heartbeat with sporadic, skipped beats. The marine biologist who was giving the lecture was talking about whale migration patterns, stopped in the middle of his statement, frowned, and listened to the engine noise before continuing his presentation, but it was clear he was preoccupied with whatever he was listening to. During dinner that night, Captain Williams declared over the ship's intercom system that the most horrifying week of my life. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice sounded attentively through the speakers, unlike anything I had ever heard. One of our main electrical systems is having some minor technical issues. Our engineering team is attempting to fix the problem, but we might encounter sporadic power outages as a precaution. One of our main changes over the course of the next few hours. I want to reassure everyone that everything is safe. Systems are still completely functional, so there's no reason to be concerned, but there was concerning, and it soon became clear that the captain was downplaying how serious whatever was taking place in the engine room of the ship. The lights kept flickering more frequently during dinner, and the ship's air conditioning system started to alternate between on and off, leaving some parts of the ship. Some became nearly freezing, while others became uncomfortable warm. The elevators began breaking down, stranding travelers for minutes at a time between floors, before lurching back to life with mechanical moans that indicated the ship's power distribution systems were seriously malfunctioning. The situation took a sharp turn at around 10:00 p.m. when Tom and I were enjoying drinks at the Commodore Club. Suddenly, half of the ship was in total darkness. The tastefully decorated lounge, which had been brightly lit just moments before, a hive of conversation turned into a haunting cavern full of Sharpie, with the emergency lighting creating odd shadows on the walls and the sounds of terrified passengers. Engines that had spent the entire day battling that erratic rhythm all of a sudden became utterly quiet, abandoning us to float helplessly in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. In the shadows, you could hear crew members running through the corridors, shouting instructions to each other in languages I didn't acknowledge. The ship's communication system started to broadcast emergency announcements, but the announcements kept cutting out in the middle of sentences due to sporadic power outages, forcing passengers to fill in the voids with their worst fantasies and anxieties. Passengers who are total power outage. All passengers are still on board the engineering teams. Try to. The most frightful sound I had ever heard was the silence where the engine noise should have been. In addition to providing propulsion, engines on a ship in the middle of the ocean provide life support by powering the lights, water pumps, air circulation, navigation systems, and the communication devices, as well as everything else necessary to sustain 600 individuals while floating on one of the world's most hazardous bodies of water. The Queen Mary 2 was merely a very big, pricey coffin floating wherever the currents in the Atlantic desired accept it. Tom, who had always maintained his composure under pressure, took hold of my arm in the darkness. "This is bad," he said in a whisper, and from someone who had dedicated his. Those 3 words were more powerful than any dramatic speech when discussing a career that involves high levels of stress. Might have been nearby. Other travelers were starting to freak out. Some were sobbing in the corner, while others were asking crew members for answers that they obviously didn't have. As everything else failed, including the heating system, the temperature in the lounge was already beginning to drop. Just enough light was available for safe mobility thanks to emergency lighting, but it gave everything an unsettling red glow that gave the ship's opulent interiors the appearance of something from a horror film. We could hear banging and shouting from below us on the decks, where the engineering crew was presumably working feverishly to restore power before things became seriously dangerous. But as the hours went by without any enhancement, it became evident that this was not a straightforward mechanical issue that could be resolved using conventional methods. At about 2 in the morning, Captain Williams announced once more, and this time the gravity of our predicament was not downplayed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must be utterly truthful with you regarding our current situation. We have encountered a total failure. Both our backup generators and our main electrical generating system have experienced issues. Right now, our engineering team is only using emergency battery power, which will last for about 18 hours. Team is working non-stop to bring the main power back, but I have to let you know that we have issued a distress call signal and are asking neighboring vessels for help." The ramifications of his remarks struck me like a physical blow. The closest port was more than 1,000 miles away. With little emergency power and floating lifeless in the water, the captain was basically acknowledging that they might not be able to correct whatever went wrong. If the engineering, we would be floating in total darkness without any heat, air circulation, or power if the team was unable to restore it. Communication systems, and no means of requesting assistance. The following 16 hours were a nightmare of mechanical malfunctions and growing desperation. The ship's water pump failure prevented us from having running water for cooking, drinking, or sanitation. When the waste management systems failed, unhygienic conditions resulted, conditions inside the ship. The ship's interior temperature decreased as a result of the heating systems failing, steadily as the hull was penetrated by the chilly Atlantic air, and passengers huddling in groups for warmth. They started to bundle up in all of the clothes they had brought. Without power for the kitchens, service became impossible, so the crew started distributing whatever non-perishable they could locate emergency supplies, but with 600 people to feed and no means of. The rations were inadequate and unsatisfactory. They were insufficient to heat water or even prepare hot meals. Dehydration became a major issue as people attempted to preserve the finite supplies of drinking water while coping with amidst the anxiety of our circumstances. The most horrifying element was the total lack of communication. We were unable to communicate with the outside world or get updates regarding possible threats since the satellite systems were without power. Rescue operations. We were adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, and everyone on land was aware that we had. Families would be anticipating our arrival in New York in 2 days, but we had no way of informing them. We just vanished. With roughly 2 hours remaining on the emergency batteries, we found ourselves adrift in the middle of the ocean, helpless. When it appeared as though we might actually have to deal with the possibility of total power outages in the middle of the Atlantic, one of the backup generators was partially turned on by the engineering team, but there wasn't enough power to operate the ship normally. But it was enough to bring back the basic life support systems, some lighting, and the majority of, crucially, communication apparatus. Captain Williams promptly made contact with the Coast Guard and a number of nearby commercial ships, asking for supplies and emergency support. 3 separate ships converged on our position during the subsequent rescue operation to offer food, water, emergency power generators, and technical assistance for repairs of our primary systems. It required an additional 4 days of non-stop labor by groups of before the Queen Mary II's power systems were sufficiently repaired to allow it to limp into New York. Engineers from several ships harbor on our own initiative, 5 days late, and with everyone on. The incident left the board traumatized, and the investigation subsequently showed that a cascading electrical failure had been caused by a ship's power management system design flaw that only showed up in certain weather conditions and operational conditions. Both primary and backup power generation were simultaneously shut down by the failure, making the ship entirely reliant on emergency batteries, which were never intended to power a ship of that size for prolonged periods of time. The encounter fundamentally altered my viewpoint on sea travel and made me recognize the extent to which these enormous ships rely on intricate systems that can fail in ways that leave thousands of people in the middle of the ocean, unable to help themselves. Each time I see those ads for leisurely ocean cruises make me think of those frightful hours drifting helplessly across the Atlantic, and I recall that the sea doesn't care about our faith in technology or human engineering when nature and mechanical malfunction choose to work together against us. To commemorate our 10th wedding anniversary, my wife Karen and I made the decision to go on a second honeymoon cruise back in July 2015 anniversary. Having married young, we had dedicated the first 10 years of our marriage to establishing our careers and purchasing our first home, so we had never really had the opportunity to go on the romantic getaway we had always fantasized about. On the MSC Splendida, we reserved a 14-day Mediterranean cruise with the intention of travel to Italy, Spain, Greece, and France, and take advantage of all the opulent facilities of a ship with more than 4,000 passengers and crew. Karen had spent months anticipating this journey, making thorough itineraries of everything we wished to see and do, and investigating each port. The MSC Splendida was a stunning vessel with several pools and tasteful Italian design throughout. 18 decks are home to eateries and entertainment venues. Our balcony, with a stunning view of the Mediterranean, the cabin on deck 11 was where we spent ours. The first few days were spent simply admiring the azure waters and the breathtaking sunsets that we could see from our private terrace. The ship's passengers created a joyous, global ambiance from dozens of nations, and the Italian hospitality of the crew made. Instead of being treated like paying customers, everyone feels like honored guests. Karen was in her element, photographing everything, experimenting with new dishes, and creating. On the 6th day, we were sailing between ports and made friends with other passengers at our designated dining table. The Greek islands in comparatively calm waters, where our ideal getaway turned into 8 years later, I'm still plagued by the same nightmare. Karen and I had spent the afternoon touring Santorini and exhausted but content, after a day of hiking through the island's breathtaking scenery, returned to the ship at around 6 p.m. volcanic scenery. We made the decision to use our room for a peaceful dinner on our balcony. Service, sharing a bottle of wine and taking in the sunset over the INC and discussing how, in our hectic lives, we had been missing romantic evenings like this one. Around 9:00 p.m., Karen made the decision to take some pictures of the ship's wake in the moonlight after dinner. As we cruised through the ocean, the waves were exquisitely calm, with only a slight swell that caused the ship to rock. Karen stood at the very edge of our balcony railing at night, attempting to obtain the ideal viewpoint in order to record the moon's journey across the sky, as well as the ship's lights reflecting on the water. Dark sea. As I was preparing for bed and clearing away our dinner plates in the cabin, I heard the sound, a quick, frightened scream followed by a splash that will recur in my nightmares for the rest of my life that appeared to be so far below us. Karen was, as I hurried to the balcony, gone. The railing that she'd been leaning against was still there. Her camera was sitting on the deck chair where she'd left it, but my wife had just disappeared into the night in the Mediterranean. Initially, my mind. People don't simply vanish from cruise ship balconies, so there had to be some reason why they couldn't comprehend what had happened. Rational justification. Perhaps she had returned inside via the other door. Perhaps she was in the bathroom. Perhaps it was all in my head, but as I called her name and as we looked everywhere in our tiny cabin, the terrible truth set in. Karen had somehow fallen overboard, and she was currently behind us in the shadowy ocean. Most likely I began to scream as the enormous ship continued its nighttime journey, already hundreds of yards away, for assistance and beating on our cabin's walls in an attempt to attract the attention of our neighbors or anybody who might hear me. I was on the phone with guest services in a matter of minutes, barely able to speak clearly while I attempted to explain that my wife had gone overboard and that the ship needed to be stopped. Right away, a woman with a strong Italian accent who worked in guest services kept asking me to relax, as if the idea of a passenger going overboard was so unimaginable that she couldn't come down and repeat what I'd said, comprehend my desperate justifications. At last, after what seemed like hours, but ship security and a number of officers, including the captain, arrived at my cabin in what was likely just 10 minutes. Captain Romano, a somber man in his 50s, listened to my story with the sort of expert calm that you would want in an emergency. But as I explained the sequence, I could see the worry in his eyes of events. After hearing my account, he gave the order for the ship to carry out a Williamson turn, a particular maneuver intended to return a ship to the precise location where an individual went overboard as rapidly and effectively as possible. The sensation of the enormous ship abruptly. It was unbelievable how quickly the MSC Splendida changed course. Just moments before, they had been sailing calmly when they suddenly started to execute a broad, sweeping turn, and crew members everywhere on board responded with such efficiency that emergency lights came on, indicating that they had prepared for this exact situation. Search teams started setting up with strong spotlights and rescue gear all over the ship and announcements in Marco. All passengers were told in multiple languages to stay in their cabins while the crew conducted emergency. However, even as the ship sped back toward the scene of Karen's fall, I was aware that we were up against impossible odds. By the time we started the search, she had been in the water for at least 20 minutes and in the dark ocean. Unless she was in the direct line of one, a person was virtually invisible at night of the searchlights. From the deck of a cruise ship, the Mediterranean may appear serene and tranquil, but when you're at night, floating by yourself in the middle of it turns into a huge, terrifying wilderness where survival is determined by hours at most. The most desperate and intense thing was the search operation. I've never seen the ship's crew use all of their emergency gear, including searchlights, infrared cameras that could detect body heat in places hundreds of meters away, as well as powerful enough to the sea, rescue crews on emergency rafts, and even a helicopter that had been called in from the closest Greek island. But there are thousands of square miles of open ocean to search for just one person. It's like trying to find a particular grain of sand on a beach in the dark. After a few minutes, all the lights would focus on the person who shouted that they had spotted something in the water region, only to discover trash, a fragment of seaweed, or simply the image of the moon on the waves. Over the course of the hours, the truth of our predicament became growing more and more desperate. Karen was wearing sandals and a light dress when she fell, clothing that would offer no protection from the unexpectedly cold nighttime temperatures in the Mediterranean. Even if she was a great swimmer, but within an hour, hypothermia would start to set in, and after 2 or 3 hours in the water, there would be almost no chance of survival. The search teams carried on with commendable commitment, but I could tell by their expressions that they were merely following a protocol they were aware was likely futile. Following 7 hours of intense searching, at around 4 in the morning, Captain, the decision that I had been dreading was made by Romano. The search had looked everywhere that Karen might have drifted according to wind and current calculations, and kept using the ship's crew and resources for what would not benefit anyone if it had turned into a recovery effort instead of a rescue. The helicopter had returned, the rescue crews had been dragged back on board, and the MSC Splendida slowly made its way to base after running out of fuel. returned to its original path in the direction of our next planned port. The psychological effects of that. It was more devastating than anything I had ever experienced when they formally stopped searching for my wife. It meant acknowledging that Karen was no longer with me, that the person I had spent 10 years of my life with had just disappeared into the Oaya and would never return home. The cruise ship, which had been. Just hours before, our floating paradise turned into a prison where thousands of people were having a good time. Vacations, as I struggled to accept the fact that my wife had perished in the shadowy water behind us. To their credit, the crew made every effort to support me during the immediate crisis, offering grief counseling, made arrangements for me to disembark at the next port where I could get in touch with Karen's and my own families, and could take a plane home and start the unachievable task of reconstructing my life without her. But the inquiry into how Karen had fallen and disclosed information that further compounded the tragedy of her death and absurd. Our cabin's balcony railing, which ought to have been 42 feet high, was only 39 in accordance with safety regulations, presumably because of a Karen was 5 feet 8 and had a construction error that had been ignored for years and had been bending to take her picture. And the combination of the railing's lower than normal height and the slight rocking of the ship had been sufficient to push her over the edge. A lawsuit was eventually settled by the cruise line for an undisclosed sum, but no amount of money could bring back the woman who had been thrilled about photographing the Mediterranean's moonlight. See, the encounter ruined my ability to enjoy travel or anything in general for a number of years. Whenever I see advertisements for cruise vacations, I always see happy couples. While having romantic dinners on a balcony, I consider how easily paradise can turn into hell and how the ocean doesn't concern for your future goals or vacation arrangements. Karen fell into. From our balcony, the water appeared serene and inviting, but once she was in it by herself, in the dark, it became her grave. My wife was taken by the Mediterranean Sea, which returned nothing but the recollection of her scream and the sound of that sudden splash that altered everything. In April of 2014, Dorothy, my mother-in-law, insisted on taking the full. She had been preparing to celebrate her 70th birthday with her extended family on a cruise. Dedicated to seeing all 3 of her children, their spouses, and her 6 grandchildren, she traveled for more than a year. We scheduled a 10-day trip together for what she described as a quote, proper family vacation. 14 family members, ages 8 to 70, traveling in the Eastern Caribbean on the Carnival Liberty deck, 6 connecting cabins. Dorothy was thrilled to have everyone there, that she had thoroughly investigated every eatery, every activity, and every shore excursion, making thorough itineraries to guarantee that everyone made the Carnival Liberty was the majority of what she referred to as her ideal vacation. Exactly what a carnival ship should be, colorful, bright, and made with families in mind. Collectively, with more than 3,000 people on board, the ship was always bustling. From grandparents trying their luck in the casino to children playing on the pool decks, the ship's dining options appeared to infinite buffets, specialty eateries, round-the-clock room service, and there were snack bars on each deck, and Dorothy was always in heaven, taking pictures of the family, experimenting with different dishes, going to shows in the evening, and making what she hoped would be lifelong memories. During the first 4 days of the cruise, everything was just as we sat at the designated family table in the main hall, as Dorothy had hoped. Dining room each evening. Spent days relaxing by the pool as the children explored the area and played in the water. Ports in St. Martin and St. Thomas as a single, joyful group. Dorothy repeatedly said, seeing her kids and grandkids connect in ways that never seemed to happen made it the best week of her life. Back home, at our customary holiday get-togethers, the ship's buffets turned into our favorite place to meet, particularly the Sea Day brunch on Deck 9. Each morning, to discuss our plans for the day over plates full of pastries, bacon, eggs, and fresh fruit. As we were sailing toward Barbados on the 5th morning, our family vacation turned into a medical emergency, nightmare that would haunt us all for years to come. At around 9 in the morning, we had assembled for our customary buffet breakfast, a.m., and Dorothy was especially thrilled, since she had heard the chef was making a unique seafood display. The buffet, which featured fresh Caribbean catches, looked amazing. Numerous dishes, exquisitely arranged seafood salads, exotic fruits, and lavish dessert displays that attracted large groups of travelers with cameras. Dorothy insisted that we try the chef's special crab salad, which she said looked delicious, and we all piled our plates high with different items. Delicious. After 3 hours or so, as we were relaxing by the pool, my Tyler, an 8-year-old nephew, began complaining of stomach pain and soon began throwing up violently over his pool chair's side, exposing all of his food. At breakfast in a manner that caught other travelers and the pool deck employees' attention right away before we could even clean him up and return him to his cabin. Jennifer, my sister-in-law, began to exhibit the same symptoms. Dorothy herself was soon after, becoming so severely ill that she could. By 2:00 p.m., 10 of our 14 family members were having trouble standing up. Severe symptoms of food poisoning, including fever, explosive diarrhea, violent vomiting, and cramps in their abdomens that caused them to writhe in pain in their cabin beds. Medical facility, which was intended to treat common ailments and minor injuries, was unexpectedly overloaded with dozens of other travelers who had reportedly consumed from the same tainted buffet, in addition to our family. With only 2 physicians and 3 nurses, the medical staff was totally ill-equipped to deal with the rapidly spreading foodborne illness outbreak throughout the ship. Dr. Peterson, the ship's chief physician, was a capable individual who had spent years handling common medical problems on cruise ships, but he'd never encountered anything similar to the events on the Carnival Liberty. By nightfall, more than 200 passengers were reporting. The number was increasing hourly and showed signs of severe food poisoning. The ship's medical facilities that appeared sufficient for a ship of this size were totally overloaded as sick. Outside the medical center, passengers lined the corridors, many of them also. Dorothy, who had been most thrilled about the cruise, became one of the people who was too weak to stand while they waited for treatment, the sickest patients. Her body was unable to cope with the extreme electrolyte imbalances and dehydration at the age of 70, due to the frequent diarrhea and vomiting, and we looked on helplessly as she changed from the lively, vivacious woman who had organized the entire trip to a barely conscious, lying in her cabin bed with an IV line that, following her 3rd visit to the hospital, the medical staff had finally succeeded in placing. Engulfed the medical facility, her lying there, gray-faced and breathing difficulties, as the sounds of other family members' severe illness reverberated through our connecting cabins, was utterly devastating. The ship's crew closed the buffet in an attempt to control the outbreak, putting improved sanitization practices into place and cleaning restaurants. But it was too late. The contamination had already dispersed across the ship's food service systems, and patrons who had previously dined in the main dining rooms placed orders. A startling number of people were getting sick from room service or even from grabbing snacks from the pool deck. By the outbreak's 2nd day, more than 500 passengers, nearly 16% of all passengers, were exhibiting symptoms on board, which ranged from mild nausea to the type of extreme dehydration that necessitated prompt medical attention. Being stranded on a ship with so many sick people had a psychological impact that was nearly as severe as the physical ones itself. The cruise's typically joyous ambiance had been swapped out for an eerie silence that is only broken by the sounds of illness. The announcements regarding improved cleaning practices and the ongoing movement of medical staff in an effort to assist patients who greatly exceeded their capacity to deliver quality care. The corridors stank of vomit and disinfectant were combined, and everywhere you looked, travelers who appeared weak, pale, and terrified about the state of their health and vacation. When Dorothy entered septic shock on the 3rd day of the outbreak, the situation reached its most critical point. She was suffering from a bacterial infection and extreme dehydration. Her kidneys started to fail, her blood pressure fell dangerously low, and Dr. Peterson had to make the tough choice to call for an emergency medical evacuation. While we were still 200 meters from the closest port, a Coast Guard helicopter was sent to meet the ship, and we watched as Dorothy was hoisted onto a stretcher and strapped into the helicopter that would transport her to The remainder of our family was left on the ship, too ill to go to the hospital in Puerto Rico, travel, and was too preoccupied with Dorothy to enjoy the rest of the cruise. The ship had been turned into what appeared to be a floating hospital with CDC medical staff who had been transported in to assist with the investigation of the contamination's origin and to offer further medical assistance. Concluded that the ship's main galley's improperly stored seafood was the cause of the outbreak. The same crab salmonella and other harmful bacteria were found in the salad Dorothy had been so excited about, that had subsequently cross-contaminated other areas used for food preparation. When we eventually docked in Fort Lauderdale, there were more than 600 passengers and 150. The ship was placed under quarantine for thorough sanitization right away after crew members were impacted by the outbreak. And before being permitted to disembark, every passenger underwent a medical examination. Our family was one of the last to depart because a number of participants required further medical clearance and were still too weak to travel. That Dorothy had organized as a once-in-a-lifetime celebration turned into a medical catastrophe that left half our relatives who need to be admitted to the hospital and receive follow-up care due to food poisoning complications. Dorothy battled kidney failure for 2 weeks while in the hospital in Puerto Rico. Additional septic shock complications. She eventually made a full physical recovery, but the woman who'd been so never quite felt the same level of excitement about taking the family on a dream vacation before she developed a phobia of dining establishments and get-togethers that continued for years, and she never mentioned going on another family vacation. The ensuing lawsuit disclosed that the cruise line had received numerous citations for food safety violations in the months prior to our cruise, but had not taken sufficient corrective action. The entire experience altered our family's perspective on travel and food safety, particularly on cruise ships, where any contamination can spread quickly through the same kitchens that thousands of people eat from cramped quarters. What was meant to be a family unity celebration turned into a traumatic event that left us all with chronic health problems and a profound mistrust of the dining operations on cruise ships. Every time I see those opulent cruise buffets and commercials, I consider how easily paradise can devolve into a medical catastrophe when fundamental food safety procedures are not followed. And I recall Dorothy was fighting for her life while unconscious in that helicopter because on what should have been the most amazing week of her life, she wanted to sample the chef's special crab salad. In March 2020, 2 weeks prior to the global shutdown brought on by CO-19, my husband Greg and I were able to fit in a 7-day Western vacation, which we believed would be our final one for a while. We had spent months organizing this trip as a Caribbean cruise on Royal Caribbean's Allure of the Seas, commemoration of Greg's recovery from a mild heart attack that he had experienced the year before, and our physician had approved his travel on the condition that we take it easy and refrain from any demanding activities. The timing seemed ideal. We had spent a week in the warm weather after escaping the start of what everyone was referring to as flu season. Sunshine in the Caribbean, traveling to new ports, and the allure of the... With more than 6,000 passengers, Seas was one of the enormous floating cities for which Royal Caribbean is renowned, containing ice skating rinks and rock climbing walls, among other things. Our balcony, the cabin located on Deck 9, boasted a stunning view of the ocean. During the initial days, everything felt exactly the same as we headed toward our first port of call across the Gulf of Mexico. Greg appeared more energized. We had been looking forward to a restful vacation than he had been in months, and after a year of worrying about his well-being and our relationship, I could finally unwind. Financial status after his medical expenses. Our third point of contact was Costa, Mexico, a specially constructed cruise port that was intended especially to manage the enormous ships that frequently brought thousands of tourists to the Yucatan Peninsula. In essence, the port area was a sizable retail and dining center, encircled by tour companies that provide trips to beaches, cenotes, and ancient Mayan ruins and other nearby attractions. Greg and I had reserved what appeared to be an hour-long guided tour of the Chachabin ruins that is both safe and tranquil inland, then have lunch at a neighborhood eatery and spend some time exploring the nearby small town. The tour was run by Maya Adventures, a business that received great feedback regarding the cruise ship's excursion website and guaranteed worry-free travel, expert guides, and air-conditioned transportation for cruise guests of all ages. At approximately 8 o'clock, we disembarked in Costilla. A.M., thousands of travelers from 3 distinct cruise ships were crowded into the port, all excited to discover this region of Mexico that was unfamiliar to the majority of us. The Maya, there were roughly 30 people on the adventure tour, the majority of whom were middle-aged. Americans just like us were loaded onto a contemporary air-conditioned bus that was being driven by a hospitable Mexican man named Carlos, who appeared to be informed about the history and attractions of the area and spoke fluent English. Maria, the tour guide, was a young woman who had grown up in the area and was very knowledgeable about Mayan culture and the importance of the archaeological sites we would be visiting. During the first hour of our journey, we passed through tiny towns, and everything seemed like the kind of cultural experience we had been hoping for, including the jungle landscapes. The Chashoben, the ruins, were fascinating. There was a complex of old temples and pyramids, with vibrant birds soaring overhead and howler monkeys yelling from the trees in the middle of a dense jungle. Maria guided us around the site, describing the Maya civilization's history and highlighting architectural elements that made these historic buildings come to life in ways that both of us felt experiencing something genuinely unique. Greg was continuously taking pictures. He was more enthusiastic and involved than I had seen him since his heart attack, and I recall believing that this trip was precisely what he required to regain his self-assurance and zest for life. We were wrapping up our tour of the ruins at about noon and getting ready to return to the bus for lunch that our serene cultural encounter started to turn into something dreadful. As we made our way back, we heard shouting and what sounded like gunshots coming from the direction where our bus was heading toward the parking lot. Should have been waiting. Maria's face turned pale, and she began harming our group in the direction of someone else right away, walking out of the parking lot and into a cell while speaking quickly in Spanish. Through shaky English and evident panic, Maria described the phone she had taken out of her bag. The local police had been having some issues, so we were told to avoid the main road until, although everything was safe, as we huddled behind a partially rebuilt temple wall, we could hear cars speeding through the jungle roads and the sound of gunfire approaching, and Spanish-speaking men yelling. Our bus driver Carlos came racing through the trees in our direction, shouting something quickly while his face was covered in blood from what appeared to be a cut on his forehead. Spanish that brought Maria to tears. Over the course of the following frightful hour, we discovered that our tour had unexpectedly reached Chachobin on the day that a territorial conflict between competing drug cartels broke out. In the vicinity, Carlos, who had seen the start of the altercation, claimed that armed men had set up. Several tourist buses encountered roadblocks on the main highway leading back to Costa Maya, been halted with travelers being robbed, and, in certain situations, captured as hostages to be used as leverage in. Regardless of the conflict between these criminal groups, our bus, which had been parked we were left stranded in the middle of the ruins after the site at the entrance had been shot at and was no longer functional. Gunfire in the Yucatan jungle, where there is no means of communication or transportation, continued intermittently throughout the afternoon, appearing distant at times, and, at other moments, frighteningly near. Maria had been able to get in touch with other tour operators via her cell phone, and the news became more concerning. Several groups of tourists were stuck at different places in the area. Armed men commanded the main roads, and Mexican military troops were allegedly preparing to respond to what authorities were referring to as a security crisis, but military action. We were confined to an old ruin site, and it might take hours or even days. With little water, no food, and no idea when it would be safe to try. Upon arriving back at our cruise ship, Greg, who had been in excellent physical condition the entire time, started exhibiting of heart issues brought on by stress. As our circumstances worsened, the extreme heat, dehydration, anxiety, and the physical strain of trekking through the jungle were all combined to putting a strain on his healing heart, and I could observe him gasping for air, as he attempted to maintain composure in the face of our situation. A number of other travelers in our group were also experiencing health problems. A man with diabetes was exhibiting symptoms of heat exhaustion, and an elderly woman was not expecting to be away from it for more than a few hours. He was running low on insulin that he had left on the bus. After more than 4 hours of hiding in the ruins, Maria got a call at Page M that would decide whether we'd survive and return to our ship. A local tourism industry contact had scheduled a helicopter to rescue cruise passengers who were stuck in multiple locations, but the pickup points were hazardous and would need us to travel through regions where cartel activity was still going on, or spend the night hidden at the ruins, wishing that Mexican troops would take control of the region by morning. But without food, insufficient water, and multiple individuals in need of medical care, remaining in one place could be as risky as trying to get to the evacuation point. In order to attempt the helicopter pickup, one had to depart the ruins, relative safety, and the 2-mile trek through the thick jungle to arrive at a clearing where the plane could safely land. Maria cautioned us that we might run into armed men while the journey, and that we should fully cooperate and not object to any demands made if we were stopped. Every sound made us freeze in fear, and the jungle hike felt like something out of a nightmare. The possibility that someone with a gun could be seen moving through the trees, and the fact that we were miles away from assistance and entirely reliant on criminals' choices and our Mexican guides, made each step feel like Greg had a lot of trouble on the hike, and it might be our last. His face was turning gray, and his breathing was becoming labored, reminding me of the day he had suffered a heart attack. However, the helicopter evacuation is our only option, and gunfire is still reverberating through the jungle behind us. Realistic possibility of getting to safety, so he had to keep going and hope his heart could handle it. The tension, until we were able to provide him with appropriate medical care aboard the ship. We arrived at the evacuation location as the Mexican military helicopter landing in that jungle clearing. As the sun was setting, the most passengers were loaded. The evacuation was executed with military efficiency, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Swiftly and transported straight to the Costa Maya port, where local authorities and cruise ship medical staff were waiting to help anyone in need right away. The flight took less than 20 minutes in total, but we could see smoke rising from multiple places as we peered down at the jungle roads where we had been stranded. Military vehicles speeding in the direction of clearly ongoing battles. After 12 hours, at around 8 p.m., we eventually boarded the Allure of the Seas again. Following what should have been a straightforward cultural tour, Greg headed straight to the ship's medical facility for cardiac assessment. As I attempted to comprehend that we had just survived, although Greg's heart displayed symptoms of stress, the ship's medical staff concluded that he hadn't experienced another cardiac event. He should be okay for the rest of the cruise with rest and supervision, but it took months for us to completely comprehend the psychological effects of our time in Mexico. The cruise line paid for Greg's medical bills and provided complete refunds for the outing, but they also made it clear that travelers were at their own risk when they decided to disembark from the ship in foreign ports, and that the security situation could abruptly and quickly change in many Caribbean and Mexican locations. Discovered that more than 200 cruise passengers, including our group, had been stranded by cartel violence that day, and that before military forces regained control, a number of tourist buses had been set on fire and their occupants had been robbed. To the region, the encounter fundamentally altered our perspective on shore excursions on cruise ships and helped us understand that when you get off a cruise ship in a foreign port, you're in a place where local politics are out of your control, crime, or security circumstances that could suddenly become fatal. What had appeared as a well-planned, secure tour run by respectable businesses turned into a battle for survival in the midst of a drug war, as well as the stunning historic sites that we had been so eager to. While armed criminals controlled the surrounding roads, Explore served as our hiding place. Every time I see those glossy, I consider cruise brochures that promote exotic shore excursions. Dreadful Yucatan Jungle Day, and keep in mind that paradise can turn into hell. The instant you depart from the security of your floating hotel and enter a realm where the safety of your cruise ship and medical facilities are powerless to keep you safe.